Hi everyone, good afternoon. Thanks for sticking with us. Procurement out. My first tip, without being very biased, I have to say, is Supplier Development Programme. When I set up Intend, which is a small business, we have to bid for all the work we do. The landscape was very different, and there was very little help for particularly smaller businesses trying to break into what was really the big boys' world of procurement. And we've watched the SDP grow and grow from what was face-to-face courses, which was very nice. Obviously, that's a little bit different now. But nothing at all of the scale of the Meet the Buyers, the engagement that Gillian and her team has developed. So definitely, if you're only using the SDP site to register these sort of events, please go onto the site and have a look. Get the newsletter, read it through if you don't, because literally there's more and more opportunities that get you in front of buyers, as well as the top tips type courses like this. So I'm going to just try and perhaps highlight, we don't have very much time, but just based on the experience that we've had working day to day with small business, third sector, also some very large companies, I have to say, who also suffer. And try and draw out not how you use all the systems, but maybe some tips along the way to try and improve the performance as we go along. So I'll cover a little bit about the public sector itself, because I think there are a few misconceptions about the actual size of it. We will, of course, take a quick look at PCS and some of the issues, the problems with getting proper notices in. I'll mention very briefly the PCS tender portal, but that's really something that will be picked up with some of the future training for the actual courses themselves. I've got a little bit of coverage, particularly of improving your tender score and hopefully some practical techniques. And there are some other sources of free support other than SDP. I'll be at the stand, by the way, afterwards if anybody's got anything a bit more in depth up at the SDP stand. So the public sector, it's not at all, trying to sell into the public sector is very different to the commercial, maybe buying and selling that we're all quite used to. So you meet someone, you get a chance to discuss what they want, you can maybe sort of taper your products round about that. And the public sector, by its very nature, is very hands-off to some extent. And the first sign we might get at some point is when the contract notices come out. So it's challenging, I would say, in that respect. It's very sort of time and deadline focused, can be a little bit rigid. The buyers are very concerned, and perhaps increasingly so, obviously, since various economic pressures, which I have to say don't come and go away, they seem to come back again. The concept of best value is very important in the public sector, and it will tend to look at this balance of quality and whole life cost. And typically in tenders, you'll be watching out for in the contract notice, it'll maybe say, this one we're looking for, say 60% of your scoring is going to be on the quality, the technical, how you're going to deliver the goods, the services, and the remainder's on the price. That is starting to change in my experience. We used to see 80%, 90%, sometimes 100% price-only tenders. That's not allowed in Scotland now, so there has to always be a quality element. But it is an area where perhaps in people's bid-no-bid decision, you will take a look at these kind of weightings and decide on that basis whether you want to bid, if it's very price-focused. And it can perhaps, that could be an advantage if you're perhaps low-cost, local supplier, that can help too. I've highlighted in orange the areas now in tenders, and this has been the biggest change in my experience, perhaps in the last 4 to 5 years. Old-fashioned tenders focused on, you know, how are you going to deliver, your kind of methodology, health and safety, the kind of really the technical aspects of the bid. And as suppliers, that was great because we know how it all works. And more and more and more now, you're getting really substantial sections on community benefits, sustainability, net zero, very policy driven, particularly in Scottish bids, so it's the Scottish Government putting the pressure on the rest of the public sector. I've been doing quite a lot of work, as I say, even with some really large companies, and they honestly struggle with this as well. So as smaller organisations bidding, please take some confidence from that, because in my experience, I think as smaller bidders, we've probably got some nicer, more flexible, smarter ideas that we can offer in some of these kind of softer areas that you have to get to grips to with the tenders. There's some links at the bottom there on who's involved in the public sector, but I find this is quite an interesting table from some of the slides and the coverage that we're doing, simply to say that the public sector, I think, is a temptation for us, that we think it's councils, NHS, universities, Scottish Government, all the kind of like the big ones, the very prominent ones. If you're maybe starting off in the public sector arena just for the first time, if you're quite experienced but you maybe don't have the scale and the capacity to go for some of the bigger projects, there's a massive, massive number of public bodies that all have to go through the same public sector open tendering process. So a major tip from me would be, if you're starting out, if you're not, get on to PCS. Don't wait for the contracts to come out. Go and have a look at some of these 900 plus organisations. Local authorities we know about, and so on. Some of these kind of Quango type titles actually are organisations. They're maybe literally like a legal aid board. We've got some of the ones mentioned at the bottom, so like Scottish Canals, Creative Scotland, Historic Environment Scotland, so maybe not initially ones that you would think to deal with, but at the end of the day, they all need office supplies, possibly catering, professional services. So the more you can get to know some of these smaller ones, it's definitely, I think, in terms of if you're putting together a sort of new business plan, these are definitely worth looking at. They all cover the three areas, so goods, services and works is what we're looking at in the public sector. What do they buy? We could have about 28,000 slides probably on this. I've added in my favourite, I'm afraid, at the bottom left. We were asked to help a sole trader up in Fife who has birds of prey, and he has to take them round the waste transfer station. He'd been doing it almost all of his life, and he was told that he had to tender for his birds of prey service to get rid of all the gulls and whatever. He had no idea, but we sat down, and he turned out to have the most fantastic technical knowledge, for one thing. He trained all the vets in Fife on how to deal with the birds of prey, and between us, the tender came together and he was successful. But it was a very good example of a very small type of service that you wouldn't think would have to go through that sort of process. Wherever it is that you're providing, some of the challenges lie around actually trying to then find the contracts and understanding a little bit then about the process of how the buyers buy. So they have what we'd call the regulated contracts. This is covered in a lot more detail in all the courses, but all that means is that they're subject to some form of Scottish procurement legislation. That's there to make sure that the buyers do the job properly. I can remember dealing with some of our clients where it was the old days where things came in envelopes. I've worked for an unnamed European organisation where people genuinely came in to write the tenders and then could bid for it and surprisingly win it afterwards. So those days, the procurement regulations are definitely there to protect us as suppliers, and also give us a little bit of platform, if you like, to challenge things. So in terms of getting feedback, again, hugely improved over the years. They're published on Public Contract Scotland, so I'll be quite surprised if nobody's here has not registered for that yet. But again, that in 2008, that was a massive breakthrough to make that many contracts available so easily and so publicly in one place. You'll come across different types of contracts, what we would normally refer to as a term contract. I would call that a little bit first past the post. So great if you get it because you are the sole supplier. It's a contract, it's got a value, a start, a finish, an end, clear deliverables. However, if you don't get it, then obviously those term contracts could be quite lengthy and it's quite some time before you then can get another chance to bid. Alternatively, and I think if for any of you that are bidding regularly now, you're going to see quite a lot of what's called framework contracts. Frameworks are very well regulated now as well. They used to get set up for about 10, 12 years. They're now 4 years only. But they pull together something sort of resembling an approved list. So approved lists aren't legally allowed now in the same way they used to be. The difficulty with a framework is you can be accepted as a framework provider, but you can get absolutely no or very little work from it. Typically, a framework might include maybe 5, 6 suppliers, and if it's a ranked framework, then the first ranked, i.e. the highest score, will get offered all the work first, then it goes to the second. So if you're 3, 4, 5 down the line, there can be some issues. The Supplier Development Programme has a very nice framework approach, so it's called rotational, and that could be quite common in maybe professional services. So for training, all of the suppliers on Gillian's framework go literally offered the chance in rotation, and that's quite a nice way if you can find rotational. If you see frameworks advertised and it's not clear from the documentation if it's ranked or not, that's an early question to definitely get in. I've mentioned dynamic purchasing systems, and that's something that probably over the last 2 to 3 years has been quite an interesting development, and that can be an area if you're smaller, perhaps if you're newer to public sector markets, to get onto these. It's almost like a pre-qualification type exercise. So you apply to join the dynamic purchasing system. The buyer wants to set it up because they want people to be able to come in and out of their list of suppliers all the time. So the ones that we've worked on, for example, taxi drivers, the school transport, DPS for training, I think flexible, the SDP one is much the same. So you might start to see some of these more flexible arrangements, and that's definitely worth looking for. And quite often in these ones, you don't have to put any pricing in. It's all about that kind of stage one of the process. So it gets your name up there. Then when the organisations that are involved in the DPS, they would use that when they're ready to tender. So they send out the tender, everyone's already pre-qualified. The downside is the DPS list probably has grown and grown and grown. So it may start off quite a small list of suppliers, but they could grow over time. And also, we've talked a little bit about quick quotes. I think it's been mentioned quite a few times. I'll cover it in a wee bit more detail later on, just on the different types of lower level opportunities that you have as well. Subcontracting, and I think today is a fantastic opportunity when you see all the various Tier 1 contractors. Again, that's increased fabulously over the last few years. And all of them, as you'll know, have their own supply chain portals, not just the ones who are here. By the way, there's different regional hubs for all the construction hubs. Even the Scottish Wholesale Alliance, Association. You know, there's another example of a sort of supply chain activity where you might be able to get yourself registered as well. Quick quote is becoming the go-to place as well, particularly if you're either smaller or you're looking for some of the lower risk contracts to go for. The biggest point about the quick quotes is the buyer decides who to invite. They're not published on PCS, only the results later on. So you need to make it your business to find the buyers who you think might be issuing quick quotes and persuade them to be choosing you when they decide which 5, 6 or so bidders are coming through. And it's the meet the buyer events and things like this where you would actually start to do that. For goods and services, quick quotes would kick in anything under £50,000 value. And for construction, it's anything under 2 million. So that's already, I would say, a significant level, if you like, for some of this more direct buying to be taking place. There are 1 or 2 local authorities. South Lanarkshire is the one that I'm aware of the most, and they have an internal rule that says when the buyer puts together a list for quick quotes, at least 3 to 4 of the suppliers chosen to respond must come from South Lanarkshire. So that's very good if you're in South Lanarkshire, and it's very not good if, like one of my customers, you're in North Lanarkshire and South Lanarkshire is one of your major construction clients. So again, that's an area to keep track on and to ask some of the buyers what their internal policy is and are they moving. I think Fife's another one, I think, that might be moving in that direction as well. So PCS, I think you're all familiar with. We're quite lucky in Scotland because I think it's quite an easy system to use. Other systems are available elsewhere in the UK. Can I just check how many people are bidding outside of Scotland? England, Wales? Yes, 1 or 2. So there are other portals, obviously, Contracts Finder, Find a Tender Service, Sell to Wales, and they all really operate in the same way, but certainly for PCS, it's quite nicely focused, if you like, all in the one area. I think one of the things I'd wanted to highlight in terms of the tips here was about setting up your alerts. This is something when you register for PCS, you put in your basic information, and then you're asked to provide a number of category codes. And depending on what sector you're in, this could actually be quite difficult. I'm thinking of things like maybe marketing, training, notoriously difficult to sort of pin that down. Perhaps some sort of broader services are a bit more difficult to choose the codes. So when you log into this alert side, you get a chance, this is just set at the selected categories at the moment, but there are 2 tabs here, one's called Browse and one's called Search. So I would encourage you, because I think there are some developments in the codes that are being used, maybe go back and check that you've got the right sort of codes, and I would use the search facility first. Otherwise, the browse is kind of a tree structure, so it can take some time to actually go all the way down through that. The other thing I'd recommend is, every time a contract notice is published on PCS, one of the tabs, along with like full text and contacts, Q&A, towards the right-hand side, there's a tab called Codes, and you can actually click on that and see which codes the buyers have used to categorise the notice. And if that's what they're using to categorise the notice, that's what they'll be using if they start to go onto PCS and look for suppliers, particularly for quick quotes. Some of the codes are very high level, so the danger is you choose them and you get loads and loads of notices. But if you start monitoring the contract notices from the buyer, you'll find that they too tend to veer towards the higher level codes as well. So I think the matching process in PCS is a wee bit challenging. It's not maybe as sophisticated as it might be. But get your alerts right, keep them refreshed if you can. There used to be special codes. I remember, I haven't seen so many of these recently, but when the Commonwealth Games came out, you could choose Commonwealth Games as one of your alert codes, and it would feed all the opportunities in as soon as they came. So watch out for those two. Here's the important one, supplier finder profile. If you haven't filled it in at all, you're invisible for quick quotes. If you filled it in, but you haven't clicked the publish button at the top, you're invisible. So first thing is really, as soon as you can, check online and make sure that that's been done on your profile. Filling it in is very easy, obviously. Basic details, you can say which regions you want to work in. The next important part is there's a set of 6 keywords or phrases that you can fill in. And that's, I'll show you an example one just shortly. When the buyers search and maybe find 5 suppliers and look at their codes, their profiles, sorry, all they see is the keywords at the top and 1 or 2 lines of your company description. So it's a bit like the teaser text, and then you get the see more. So if your keywords aren't right, you can imagine a buyer's got, I don't know, 40 electrical suppliers to look through, or events organisers. They'll churn their way through and they'll maybe just go by the keywords. And I've seen keywords that say great service or highly innovative, you know, absolutely useless keywords. So again, try and think, what would the buyers be typing in if they're searching for me? When you write your description, again, another thing that we see all the time, really quite reputable companies, and somebody's filled it in, but they've done it dead quick, and they say, I'll come back, and they've obviously not gone back, and they've literally got about 3 lines that says, you know, we provide training services, we do this, we do that. The buyer literally can't make a decision on that basis, so for a quick quote, they will probably discard you. So again, check the level of detail. I'd be looking at a list of the main services. You can't do much formatting in the profile, but you can certainly put a list of the key things you do. I'd be looking at any accreditations, membership of any bodies, organisations. One of my clients today is in forestry, and he's omitted in all of his previous tenders to mention that he's a member of a certain trade association. It turns out it's absolutely crucial and very important. So anything like that could lift you, if you like, above other people. Awards, if you have them, fantastic. Experience, so have you already worked with the public sector? If I'm a buyer, I would like to know that. Have you worked for maybe, not big household names, but you know, what commercial organisations have you worked with? Do you do any work with the third sector, with charities? Your key, and put in inverted commas, sales message. Try to find a sort of a way that says why you're better than others, but that doesn't come across as kind of what I would call salesy brochure type, where exceed all your expectations type talk. So facts, figures, our turnovers increased from X to Y in the last few years. I've seen another good one where they say, oh well, 70% of our business is repeat business. Fantastic, so that tells you're reliable, you know, you're good. So try and boil things right down to those very much clearer messages, not kind of waffly. And as I say, the keywords and messages are absolutely crucial as well. So you won't be able to read too much of this, but this is how the full profile appears. So obviously the keywords at the top. There's a few up here that I would say, well, maybe not quite so great. You know, so you say children as a keyword, you might say, well, actually children 8 to 13, or, you know, some way to make it a bit more precise. This one, I think, has mentioned some community benefits. They've mentioned a system that they use for measuring KPIs. If I'm a buyer, I'm quite keen on that. For sure, if you've got ISO 9001, any of those type of things. But you can see it's a reasonable length. You get 4,000 characters. I think my one in Intend, I think, actually almost looks like 3/4 of a page. So I'm going to go back and reduce mine because it's a bit too long. You can't do much formatting, but you can use capital letters. So I would be breaking it up into different sections as well, so you get a decent presentation. It would be lovely if, as suppliers, we could all see each other's supplier finder profiles, but we can't. But I think that would be great, because I know we're regularly looking for partners, and this, I think, would be a great database for us to access. Okay, so that's getting registered, maybe making the most of your presence. If you're doing some initial research, perhaps new to this, finding contracts as a kind of search capability on the system can be quite a useful way to start. We've done that with perhaps clients that are new to the public sector and they're not quite sure what to expect. And to be honest, we'll probably just put in a few keywords, fairly relevant, and then just see what comes up. And it's going to be quite a mixture. It'll be contracts notices that are live and open, ready to go for, but watch out, you'll also get contract notices when you do that type of search that are expired a long time ago. Contract awards, highly useful. I have to say not absolutely 100% of contracts that are let have an award notice attached. So if you see a contract notice and you wonder who won it and you don't see the award, you're perfectly within your rights to get back to the buying authority and ask, where's the award notice? Can we see who's actually got that? You'll also get some of the quick quotes, so not the quick quote that says invite a quote, but the actual results of a quick quote. So that can be quite helpful, and if it's a buyer you're interested in, it's going to tell you that they're clearly active in publishing quick quotes. You can see it, there's a little statistic tab as well for each buyer that tells you how many quick quotes they put out. And I think the Aberdeen Shires was it was billions, wasn't it? Or millions, certainly, in quick quotes that they'd issued. So it's a massive area now, and as I say, it's kind of hidden a little bit too. And very important, the one at the bottom, the prior information notice, that's the buyer's way of telling us in the market that something's on its way. But what they quite often do is to say, here's the contract, it might be published in December, January, but hidden in the little text at the bottom is quite often an invitation to join a webinar, maybe one-to-one meetings as well. I've seen that quite frequently. However, when they publish the pin notice, as they call it, quite often those meetings are like within 2 weeks or something, so you've got to really watch out for the pins and catch them quickly. If you miss the pin and you don't register, it doesn't mean at all that you can't apply. So you can still pick the notice up later, but you might miss that opportunity. I like the contracts register, and this is also on the kind of supplier tab, the main supplier information tab. And it's effectively a sort of Excel spreadsheet for most of the major buyers. And it has a list of all the contracts currently in place. You can search for it on the main menu, and you can search for it within each buyer's profile as well. And it's a really nice way to see perhaps some of the smaller contracts, and it lets you see as well which buyers are using some of these bigger national frameworks that exist as well. So you get the title, you'll get whether it's a framework or not, or is it a call-off from a framework, and you'll get the stop and start dates plus any extensions. So again, we would encourage, most of our clients to say, well, put yourself a sort of calendar together, and you can say, right, next year this is coming up, the year after this is coming up, and it gives you an advance warning for particularly partner search, something like that consortium building you need time to do. Find the buyer I like as well. I tend to use Find the Buyer. We've got somebody who's waiting for a Scotland Excel contract coming out shortly for construction materials. It was supposed to be published last Monday, and we're all sort of waiting and think, oh, have you missed it in your email? And you keep going through your emails, and you think, actually, the quickest way is to do Find Buyer, type in Scotland Excel, and literally on a daily basis, click on the current contracts, because as soon as that notice is published, it's going to appear on that list there. So on the left here, there's a box for those sectors, those funny like non-departmental bodies I pointed out at the beginning. So again, that's quite worth a browse through. Just open some up, have a look. You can get all the housing associations, which is 200, 250 or so. Massive, massive market, buying not just trades and housing services, absolutely everything. So all of these searching, by the way, is a great job for someone on maybe an intern or somebody in work experience, because it's quite time consuming. And you can get them starting to search through using a number of different keywords and start to bring that information together for you. So on the right-hand side, you'll get your kind of results, and you click on those, and you'll get this kind of page for all the different buyers. So this is where you're going to find a tab for the current contracts. So my Scotland Excel one will be there. There'll be a tab for this one showing awards. It's for Murray Council. So again, quite interesting. Say, well, look at all these awards, and that's, I think, all in 2023. You could start to run down those and say, well, who's getting all the business in, my area for this council? And you'll get the future contracts is where you'll find these pin notices. So again, that might be quite interesting to just work your way through those. And statistics, I think I mentioned that earlier, if you want to see how many quick quotes are going out. So a big focus on PCS, obviously, but I've added some links in here to the different portals in the rest of the UK. We've got a number of clients in Dumfries and Galloway, so to be honest, Newcastle contracts, Northumberland, all of that's totally accessible to them. So don't forget that. There's Republic of Ireland as well as Northern Ireland, so all kind of English-speaking markets as well. And I've added in one of my favourites, just at the bottom here, Pro Contract Due North. So for anyone that's looking for outside of Scotland, there's a massive number of local authorities in particular, but other public sector bodies publish their tenders on Pro Contract. PCS tender has been around for a few years now, and it's been brought along by largely the Scottish Government to help with the kind of management of some of the larger bids. It was traditionally used for submitting larger tenders. There's a course, I think it's Thursday, in fact I think it's me, I'm not self-publicising, it just so happens, but it will go in a lot more detail because it is confusing. Everything will get advertised on PCS, but only a proportion of the bids will come out on PCS tender. So if you've not used PCS tender before, I would encourage you to sign up, not just for my course, our course, they're running all of the year through. It looks a bit like this. So once you've registered, it's very straightforward. There is a profile you can fill in, and some buyers do like to look at those profiles as well, but they don't do quick quotes through PCS tender. It's based on software called Bravo Solution, which I think might have been built in the 1970s, and that's another good reason for the course, because when you go onto some of these screens on this portal, it can be pretty heavy going. The beauty of it is, whereas PCS, when you submit your tender, you have to put everything into a postbox and you have to make sure that you remember everything. On PCS tender, you fill it all in more or less on the screen, you attach the documents beside the question, so it's much less easy to make a mistake, I would say. The questions is another tip area as well, so please, it does sound a bit sort of simple and stupid to say that, but we get tenders in literally a dozen almost every week that we're looking at, and I would say a good proportion have some form of mistake, not necessarily massive. They have a pricing cell and a pricing sheet that doesn't work. There's a reference to an appendix that's not been included. So anything like that, as soon as you see the notice, read through all the documents first before you start filling in your name and everything, and get the questions through. On PCS, they can't see who's asking the question. PCS tender, the buyer can. But that shouldn't be a problem. To me, it tells them that you're on the ball and you've spotted where they've maybe not been as careful as they should be. So when it comes to the actual filling in the tender, obviously it's a competition, and this is where the difference starts between putting in an okay bid that might get 3 out of 5 for your technical answers, or the one that gets 5 out of 5. So we're referring here really to hot buttons, and it's very much this idea of tapping into what the buyer actually needs and wants. And it goes back almost to that first point, that if you were sitting down with a customer in the commercial world, these are the things you would find out through your chats, getting a few more meetings. Public sector, if you don't read all the documents, and if you don't do some background research, your tender is going to look just like everybody else's, for one point, and the buyer's going to read it and say, I don't see myself here. This could have been written for anyone, any tender in the same sector. Quite a lot of the things that are mentioned here in the bullets are things that have been mentioned by quite a lot of the speakers. So community wealth building, kind of obviously value for money, how pressed your buyer is for the sort of budgets and so on. Net zero, absolutely huge. So all the public buyers are under massive pressure. We were looking at tenders recently for IT supplies, stationery, and they're sitting there saying, what can you do to help me as a buyer reach my targets and make me look good? So anything there that you can add in, maybe if it doesn't even feel relevant to what you're bidding for, is going to add value. We were looking at one yesterday for an organisation down in Kent, a housing association, and we were looking at sustainability, saying, what can we write, what can we write? And we looked, and they've just won a big sustainability award. So it's like, great, we're going to mention that so they know we know, and then we're going to see what we can tie in with them. Okay, digitisation, innovation as well, another good area where you can maybe, again, offer benefits to the buyers in terms of your systems, smart systems. So you can find this information, as I say, generally, to be honest, from the buyer website. Meet the Buyer is a good chance as well. There's quite a few Scottish Government type sites too, but it's really just this idea of drilling right down into the specification and the tender documents and feeding that back into your responses. The second thing where people routinely score down, if you like, is not providing evidence, or providing what I would call opinion. So we can deliver the best things in sliced bread type statements. We're highly valued, we're highly people-centred, You've really got to bring that back into tangible benefits for the customer in some sort of way. I like the so what test, because that kind of means that you don't, every time you say something like that, it's so what. And I also like the who, what, how, when. So when you say, here's what we're going to do in the next 4 years, it might be quite a bland statement. So come back at it again. You've said what you're going to do, how are you going to do it? What systems will you use? Who is it that's going to do it? What's the time scale? And go back on and just keep drilling and drilling at these kind of blander statements that will just get you the average marks. We are asked all the time, do you have the perfect tender answers? Give us the perfect tender and we'll just stick our name in it and we can just apply it to our tenders as well. And our response tends to be, what you're looking at is not capturing a big library full of perfect answers, but for each type of question, having what I would call a writing plan. And it could be a checklist to start with, but to be honest, each tender tends to be quite specific. So we encourage, particularly some of these more technical, complex questions, that you sit down, you try and do it with someone else, not just on your own, and start to put together a writing answer plan for these questions. And you're using the scoring to make sure that you're hitting all the right areas, but particularly important, you're referring to your colleagues. You might have people in the front line of what you're doing, drivers who are on your clients' premises all the time, your consultants, your trainers on site. It's not necessarily the someone writing the tender that's got all of that inside information. And they might say, well, what they're really interested in and what really doesn't work is X, Y, Z. And that's absolutely gold dust in getting another of these hot buttons. Okay, evidence, not opinion. Opportunities for tables, charts is always great if your format allows for that. And one thing I tend to do, if it's quite a complicated technical bid, I'll take the key, what I call the trigger words in the specification, and once we've written the technical proposal, I just use Word to do a word search and just check and see, and you've no idea how often there's quite really keywords have not even been mentioned in the answer. So it's quite a nice way to finish that off. So again, there's more courses on Improve Your Bid with a lot more detail. You need to be open to opportunities. Again, so it's not just the bigger Meet the Buyer. Balfour Beatty, as probably a lot of you might have found out, I've got an event coming up, but there's literally loads of these on the Supplier Development Programme website. If you're involved in innovation, I think this was mentioned earlier as well, by the Scottish Government. Really nice things going on now, because that's always the problem. Say, well, the buyer tells us what they want, but actually we've invented something that's actually better, cheaper. This is a nice link, I think, for you to use for that as well. And just finally, sources of free support. We've mentioned quite a lot of these already. The business gateways throughout Scotland, quite a lot of them have something called expert help, and it comes from what they call the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. And they will offer up to 3 days free consultancy help in procurement, so for help with tendering, but it's also help with marketing, digital media. So depending which area you're in, I would be checking with your own business gateway to see if there's help there as well. Okay, so sorry, a bit of a gallop through the top tips, so thanks very much for your attention.